All right. I can't see everybody, Joe. So is everyone in? Welcome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first session for the Keep the Muscles Moving program for spring of 2022. I'm really excited and happy to welcome back Tess Wilson, who was here with us in the earlier in the year to do a talk about research for writers, and this is the second part of that talk. If you were able to tune in last time, you'll certainly be able to add to your knowledge tonight, and I'm sure that if you were not able to be there last time, you can still get something really valuable out of this. Really grateful to Tess for her presence, and I'm going to read you all her official bio, and then I will turn it over to Tess. Tess Wilson is a librarian who loves talking loudly about digital literacy, equitable access, and citizen science. I love that. Currently, she serves as program manager for the network of the National Library of Medicine's Training and Education Center. She's a collector of many things, from small rocks to big books. She's also a beloved Chatham MFA alum. Take it away. Take it away, Tess.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming back, if you are coming back, but good to see everyone, new faces. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about finding materials when you're researching as a creative writer, but we'll also talk about integrating that research into your work, and also kind of what to keep track of as you go. So welcome. As Sheila said, my name is Tess Wilson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm originally from Kansas, and I mentioned it last time, but one of my first research memories is from participating in History Day in middle school. If anyone ever did History Day, it's an annual event that promotes research and kind of allows kids to dip their toes in research practices in a really fun way. So I spent a lot of time in the library as a kid for that purpose, and just because it was kind of a place of refuge. And that continued through college, and I got a job at the campus library in Kansas, and I studied English writing and literature, and then came to Chatham to pursue my MFA. But because I worked in the library in college, and I was just kind of belonged in the library and happened to get a lot of jobs in the library, I studied library science at Pitt with a focus on children's literature. And then I worked in public libraries for a few years. And now I work for the network of the National Library of Medicine, where I connect libraries with free health information resources to share with their communities. So even though I don't work in a public library anymore, supporting research is a huge part of what I do in my current position, and something I just enjoy, obviously recreationally as well. So that's me. And because I'm a librarian, I love answering questions and kind of exploring curiosities with you. So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. And then we're going to have time at the end as well for questions, but ask away as we go. So like I said, today, this is kind of our agenda. I talked a little bit about where to research and kind of where to start. I also talked about how to research last time. We're going to expand that conversation and talk about some other cool places that you can research and places to look that you have access to, either at an academic library or with the public library, and then some free and available databases as well. And then we'll talk about how to integrate that research into your work. And tonight, I would really like to make this as interactive as possible. So I have some activities for us to do and some things to chat about. And so that we'll do a couple activities related to that. And what to track. So acknowledging your resources and sort of citing or what that looks like in a creative sense, and keeping track of all your resources, which is really important. So I asked this last time, but I wanted to ask again since we might have some new folks with us tonight, and we also might have read some more stuff since the last time I saw you. So think about the last few books you read. So those could be books of poetry, fiction, whatever you have read. Think about one of those books and answer these couple of questions. What might the author have had to research in order to write that book? And do you think that research had an effect on the book as a whole? So you can either unmute or put those in the chat, but take a couple minutes and think about any books that you might have read in the recent past and what research might have gone into that.
I just read Tell Me How It Ends by, oh, I have the book here, Valeria Luiselli. And she actually has, like, in the back a really detailed kind of works cited list for her stuff. So I know she read a lot of journalism reports, but also looked into some like legal documents and like law texts.
Very cool. That's awesome. That's a great example. Cool. So another example, Claire Cameron's The Last Neanderthal. She did a lot of research, but she got one thing wrong. Cave bears are vegetarians, not carnivores. Interesting. You know what, Joshua, we're actually going to talk about stretching the truth, researching and stretching the truth. So I'm glad you pointed that out. That's going to be kind of interesting. I'll share my example too, and then maybe one more person if you feel like you want to share. So I talked about this book last time, and it made me want to read it again when I talked about this at the last workshop. It's called Road, and it's by Thomas Fox Averill. He was an old professor in Kansas. And I'll talk more about what this book is about and some of the research that he probably did for this, or that we know that he did for this. But he actually went really in depth and traveled to the Southwest to research this book and looked at a lot of letters and other materials to do research. And also it's based on a song. And so he did a lot of looking into music that was created at that time and into the history of the song. So some really cool research went into that book as well. Okay, and another example, Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. Sci-fi, so a lot of science research, but also very involved with government. So maybe government offices and positions, absolutely, yeah. And conspiracy theories, cool. I bet that was a fascinating book to research for. I'm gonna have to remember that one too. That sounds kind of up my alley. Okay, perfect. So we have to research sometimes as writers. But why might we need to research? It depends on your discipline, but the reasons for doing research are largely the same as nonfiction writers or as folks who do academic research. Fact checking, if you're unfamiliar with a subject, unfamiliar with people or places, events that might happen throughout the book. We research for accuracy, and we also research to give credit. So in the case of Road, I said it's based on a song, the Tennessee Stud. In order to really figure out the history of the song and who was really responsible for that song and all of its iterations, he did a lot of research into that to give credit to the people who created that song and wrote that history. And one other example, Black Girl in Paris, references a lot of great Black authors' travels in France. Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds like a great book too. That's great. Thank you. So ultimately, though, creative writers research in order to enrich and deepen our stories. A lot of atmosphere building, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because a lot of that research that we do, even if it doesn't hit the page, it helps us build the world around our story, right? And further, research can spark creativity. So I talked last time about the concept of serendipity in research and in information finding. And if there are any, I know there's at least one librarian in this Zoom right now. So you may be familiar with the concept of serendipity and how it plays into information seeking practices. But essentially just running into something that you didn't intend on finding, but that sparks something in you. And that happens a lot when you get into some of the resources that we'll go through today, because they're really fascinating and there's so much information available. Okay. But where do we do that research? Last time I talked about some resources. Like I said, I'm going to walk you through some more today, some public databases, a few cool databases that you have access to via Chatham's library and the public library, and then some other ways we can research as well. So one place to look is subject encyclopedias and other relevant reference books. There's also, depending on your topic, likely some state-specific resources, like state or municipal records, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Even nature guides, topographical resources, land resources, or native land resources that could be helpful depending on what you're looking into. And if you're able to take a look at reference books or guidebooks in person, they often have a lot of full color illustrations and photographs. So encyclopedias and guidebooks can also serve as inspiration for prompts or, like I said, world building exercises as well. And of course, one of my favorite encyclopedias, Wikipedia. This is actually just one of their featured articles of the day that's on here today, the Trundle, and which apparently is an Iron Age hill fort in Sussex, England. But those can be a really fun thing to explore if you're just poking around looking for inspiration. Also, Jocelyn, thank you so much. There are a lot of reference books at the library here on the Shadyside campus if people want to browse physically, which is, like I said, can be a really fun experience, and you can run into things serendipitously that you might not have otherwise. Although Wikipedia, great place for serendipity. A quick note about Wikipedia here, which it might not be news to some people, but it could be really interesting to others. In any Wikipedia entry, you'll find links to and numbered footnotes without or throughout. And so if you click on those footnotes, it'll take you down to the site, the citation for that resource. And the links can really take you down a fun research rabbit hole, because they'll lead you to other related Wikipedia entries, which can be a great way of mimicking that concept of serendipity in information science. You can sort of lead yourself on this path. But those footnotes, if you click on one of those, or if you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll find that list of references. And that's super handy when you're conducting research. So just like you can do in a scholarly article, you can use those citations to lead you to journal articles, to reference books, and other stuff too, to news clips, to videos. So keep that in mind. And I have a little activity for you. I'd just like you to look up the Wikipedia page for something related to a piece that you're writing. I know some of you are probably knee deep in your thesis at this point. So maybe something to do with your thesis. I'll do a quick example. Let me stop sharing for a second. And I'll share this example that I was using earlier. Okay. So this is the biggest ball of twine. It's in Cawker City, Kansas. But I thought it would be kind of interesting to look this up because I have been there. I'm obsessed with Kansas. And this is just a fascinating thing. The largest ball of twine. I mean, humans are endlessly fascinating. So this is the biggest ball of twine page. in Cawker City, Kansas, gives you a little history. What's really cool too about Wikipedia pages is that often they have cultural references as well. So those can be almost as interesting as those references at the bottom, because as you can see, the biggest ball of twine title has not always belonged to Kansas. So it used to be the biggest ball of twine in Minnesota. There were, as we can see here in this Atlantic article, the battle to be the world's largest ball of twine. It was featured in a Doonesbury comic. So the cultural references too can often be kind of a treasure trove of extra things that you might want to look into. And then this references down here too. So there are some, as I said, there's an Atlantic article that could be really fascinating to read. And then some other, like a CBS clip, some other things as well. So what I'd like you to do is look up a Wikipedia page related to something that you are writing about. Scroll down to those sources and then find some new material. So I'll give you a couple minutes to just do that real quick. And then come back, share anything interesting that you found in those Wikipedia entries. I'll also say a note here that Wikipedia, there are a number of reasons it's one of my favorite websites, but one of them is because it's edited by the public. Anyone can edit Wikipedia. And because of that, when you look around, if you see any links that are dead, or if you find information that is incorrect or could use a source that it doesn't have a footnote, you can add it. So you can lend your expertise about a subject to Wikipedia pages. I mean, Wikipedia editing is a whole nother workshop that I am always happy to talk about. But anyway, just a little note there that if you are ever interested in editing for Wikipedia too, that is it's a very attainable goal. It's very fun too. Wikipedia editathons. It's a great world to get involved with. And yeah, Sheila, I love the Wikipedia random page too. I'll share that. I'll share that link because that can be a really fun. A really fun adventure to go on. Anyone find some cool stuff?
I actually was thinking and writing earlier about giant pandas, which I love. So I looked up giant pandas in Wikipedia and found this article actually dating back to 2008 amid the financial crisis. And the headline is Pandas extend stay in San Diego. Zoo negotiates lower price to rent bears from China. And the first two lines are really good. It's good news in dismal times. Stock prices are down, house prices are down, but so are panda prices.
Oh, ooh, that's a big oof, but that's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, it's a good thing because the zoo is, able to rent I guess, rent
True.
lower price, but yeah.
Panda prices has a really tough ring to it, but yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't maybe hit the ear great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's super interesting. Yeah, I love that. That's wild. Anyone else want to share before we move on to some other cool places?
Yeah, I can go.
Yeah.
I recently wrote a kind of side story to my thesis about, and it had squirrels in it, and they're not really the main thing, but I thought it'd be fun to do Wikipedia for squirrels. And I found an article titled "Russian Squirrel Pack Kills Dog."
Sure.
Squirrels have bitten to death a stray dog, which is barking at them in a Russian park, local media report.
Ooh,
So
wow.
on BBC News, it looks like.
This is another fascinating thing about squirrels that I will not, because we have limited time here, I could talk forever about it, but there's a book called Unseen City, and it is so good. It's about urban flora and fauna that have adapted to live in really populated areas. There's a chapter on squirrels. Everyone, but especially you, I think it was Amber, you should look up squirrels and the NASDAQ crash. Squirrels have been responsible for millions of dollars in loss because of NASDAQ crashes. So just for future exploration. It's called Unseen City. Sorry, it's really good. It's a great book. It's one of my favorites. Okay, we had one more example. I went from a page about doggy daycare to an article about how much people spend on their luxury dogs' lifestyles. Fascinating. That could be really helpful for a story, but also kind of makes me just want to write something about that. So that's a good example of serendipity too. Okay, so before we get into library resources that, while they are free to you, might require membership of some kind to use them, either a library card or your student ID. I'm going to cover just a few of the databases that are open to the public and can be searched freely. And I'm going to take a look live at some of these. So let me stop sharing. Okay. Sorry, this is a little technical situation here. Okay. So I'll share my screen again. And okay, so let me get, okay. Oh, why did my, so a lot of people are familiar with Project Gutenberg. I was just looking around and found today some Serbian fairy tales. They often have like recently uploaded texts that are featured on the main page. And I thought this was like just the coolest thing. It's Serbian fairy tales, 1918, and it's full of these incredible illustrations. I know even in just my class alone at Chatham, there were a few of us that probably could have used something like this because our work involved various fairy tales or folklore, but also the list of illustrations is very fascinating and like very beautiful artwork as well. So this is just kind of a cool Project Gutenberg, a great resource, freely available texts of all sorts. So that's a really interesting one and totally free to dig around in. My next one is the Cornell digital collections, and I'll share that link. But this is one that I thought was really cool. I'm sorry to be flipping back and forth. This is probably a little bit annoying, but Cornell Digital Collections is a really cool resource, has a lot of interesting collections. This was one that I thought was really awesome. It's hip hop party and event flyers. from a wide time range. But they're just so neat. A lot of them are super handmade and really cool. But Cornell Digital Collections, they have a ton of other collections as well. And if you go to just the home page, again, a lot of these databases will have recently added. They'll tell you the featured articles that have been recently added. This one is fascinating, this kinematic mechanisms collection. But there are a ton of really interesting collections that might be relevant to either a time period you're writing about, a certain artist, a subculture. So that was one that I wanted to share. Hearth is another cool. Hearth is also a Cornell resource. And Hearth is about home economics. So it's a home economics archive, but it has a ton of really awesome categories. And again, these could be really interesting to take a look at if you're writing about a certain time period in the home and getting an idea of what home life was like in a specific time period. What's really cool is in any of these categories, they have a super extensive bibliography. This is 95 pages of resources that you could like pour through and search through. So really, really fascinating. And then of course, your local librarians could help you locate one of these resources if you needed to find it, or just kind of cool to look through these really extensive bibliographies. Another, of course, the Library of Congress, a great resource. And I found Library of Congress, of course, is a wonderful, it has a huge range of resources available. They also have some featured collections. This is a digital collection that I thought was really fascinating, probably because I'm reading Road, that book about the Southwest and about cowboys. But this made me really interested in this Buckaroos in Paradise collection, ranching culture in Northern Nevada. Has a ton of really great images, and includes 41 motion pictures, 28 sound recordings, just a really deep collection. And they have a ton of folk life resources too. So if you are interested in or writing about ranch life, cowboy culture, this is a great resource for that. Of course, like I said, Library of Congress, super rich resource, but this is just a great example of how rich those resources are. I believe I talked about this resource last time, but the Internet Archive is great, and is a place where a lot of really interesting collections get stored. One of those really cool collections is a Laserdisc Archive. So a lot of really cool videos and images on the Internet Archive, but these kinds of collections are really fascinating. I was just enamored with this Laserdisc collection that has old cartoons and again, could be a really interesting way to think about world building, or but there are or anything else. But there are a ton of other collections that include videos and other things as well, books, freely available books and audio as well on the Internet Archive. And I can share all these links too afterwards. I just realized I haven't put those in the chat here. And this is the last one. So, oh, no, that's not it. I'll just look it up. So the WPRDC, one other resource is open data repositories. Our local one is a joint project between the University of Pittsburgh, the City of Pittsburgh, and Allegheny County. And it's called the WPRDC, the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center. And it's a really great resource for open data. Many cities and counties, and even statewide, these kind of databases are maintained. It's a repository for civic data. So it's all the data that we make by living in a certain place. And so this database, can you all see it says data beginners, data wizards. Can you all see that? Okay, awesome. This is our local version of that. And so all the civic data we make just by living gets filtered into this database, which is really a fascinating resource to have access to, because it wasn't always collated and put together in this nice package for people. So this is a super great resource to have access to, because as this tagline says, it's the region's open data at your fingertips. Very easy to navigate, has a lot of really cool data about the city that we live in, and has some really fascinating data sets too. So if you're interested in looking into the data about a city, about what parks are in a city, what kind of green space, the demographics of a city you might have, this is a great place to look, or whatever your equivalent is where you live. We use this one a lot at the public library because it's just kind of a fascinating data set. The Allegheny County dog licenses. So if you click on one of these, it pops up a CSV data set and has all of the dog licenses from our county. So again, just a funny, kind of a funny example, but this is a great resource to know about, especially if you're if you're writing about a certain city, a certain county somewhere. All right, now I'll share my other screen again and we'll get back to this. Okay, and lastly, the census can be a super useful tool for researchers. So if you're writing about a certain place or time period, census data could give you an idea of what the landscape, the social people landscape looked like during that time. All right, so we'll talk about library databases now. So we'll take a look at an academic library database, and then we'll look at the public library, or a collection of academic library databases, and then public library databases as well. We're going to be pretty local today, so we'll start with Chatham's library. You can access Jenny King Mellon's databases from the homepage. If you're on the homepage, you should see this Find Databases link. And if you click that, you get to this page. So before we move on, just a quick recap of what a library database really is. In libraries, a database is pretty much any online source of information that often has a search engine that you can search. So there are library catalogs that index all the books and journals owned or subscribed to by a particular institution. There are article indexes that index articles within a specific academic field. There are online collections of journals or books or images, videos like we just looked at. There are citation indexes that track citations and who has cited what. And it's also important to know that when it comes to any kind of database, libraries only subscribe to certain databases. So as you can see here, Chatham has at the bottom of the screen 79 databases for you to use. And so that means that they have subscribed to those databases. You can use them for free, either with your ID or or on campus. And searching databases, I won't get into, I got into that a little bit last time. I won't get into it too much today, but they work a little bit differently than using a regular search engine. They require you to be a little more specific. And perhaps more importantly, they require you to have at least a vague idea of where you might find what you're looking for. The key to finding the right database is knowing what's in it, more or less. So some questions to ask about databases before you use them are, what subject areas does this one cover? So figure out, and usually there is a subtitle underneath the name of the database when you're scrolling through them that tells you what you're likely to find in that database. You might also ask yourself what date range it covers, and you can and you can find that out by poking into the resource and seeing what range it covers in the filter, in the search filter. In a few databases, you might also need to ask, how recent does this get? Some databases don't go up to the present. Some only go so far into the past. So understanding what time period you want to focus on could be really important in determining which database you want to use. And then ask what type of material it covers. So if you are really interested in looking into images, let's say you're looking into medical images, you'll need to know that, because certain resources will probably be more useful to you than others. But if you are looking for scholarly articles, that could be a different kind of database as well. And someone just mentioned today, let's say you were looking into law documents. You'd need to know that that was what you were looking for, and then that could lead you to the correct database, the kind of database you need. There are some multidisciplinary databases that cover a bunch of topics. So this is a table on this slide from UCLA, and they cover some of the more popular multidisciplinary databases like Jstor, Project Muse, and Web of Science, and what they contain. So I know you have access to Jstor and a couple others, I believe. Actually, Jocelyn could tell you that for sure, but you have access to some of these. These are multidisciplinary, so they have a lot of different content and might be a good place to start when you're starting your search. And Google Scholar is a nice way to search through multiple databases at once if you're just starting out and trying to get your footing. So one database that you have access to with your Chatham ID is Academic Video Online. So they have more than 68,000 titles spanning a wide range of subject areas that include anthropology, business, counseling, film, health, history, music, and a lot more. And the materials that are included in this database include documentaries, interviews, feature films, newsreels, a lot of stuff, raw footage. So as you can see, this featured collection is really interesting. North American Women's Letters and Diaries. I was poking through that when I was looking at this resource. It's a really great resource that is, again, really, really rich and deep in what it offers. And you have access to that through Chatham Library's website. Jstor, one of my absolute favorites, is millions of high quality primary sources and images from around the world. That includes art. You also have access to Artstor, which is their art collection, maps, photographs, journal articles, a lot of things, letters, transcripts, a lot of different things on Jstor. Again, that's a multidisciplinary database, so it's a really great place to start and just really fun to poke around in. They also have a dynamite newsletter. So if you're interested in signing up for a very cool newsletter that will probably prompt you weekly with something really fascinating, it's a good one to sign up for. Jstor Independent Voices is an open access digital collection of alternative press newspapers. So this is a collection within Jstor. And so it's underground press, magazines and journals. And so those periodicals were produced by feminists, campus radicals, anti-war activists, Black Power advocates, LGBTQI activists. There are a ton of really interesting resources here. But this was one in particular that I wanted to point out because it's kind of a neat, it's neat that this exists, that these are all put together in a collection, as the WPRDC says, that's at your fingertips. All right, and I'm gonna ask Joe for help on this one. So because Chatham is, because of the unique paths of study that Chatham has, you have access to some really cool databases that some universities don't. So you have access to the Bloomsbury Food Library, Food Studies Online, and then this one is kind of cool too, the Ackland Video Atlas of Human Anatomy. So Joe, if you want to share your screen really quick and we can just navigate through these. Yeah, take a look at the Ackland Video Atlas of Human Anatomy. The reason I point out this, and there's a kind of an equivalent called OpenEye. I'll type it in the chat. It's OpenEye. And that is from the National Library of Medicine. And OpenEye and this resource includes a ton of images and other resources related to human anatomy. So if you were writing about, say, a disease or an injury, a cure, a treatment, the history of medicine, these are super great resources to have at your disposal, because if maybe we can look up ear. This was one of the least gross ones that I could find. Yeah, so you can take a look at the inner workings of the ear, for example, and find out what someone's ear might look like, if that's something that you might need for a story, or you know, so it's a pretty specific resource, but a fascinating one. Because if we're writing about, let's say, a broken bone, this, you know, we might have had a broken bone at some point in our lives, but this would be a really great resource to see a broken bone, to see, you know, to examine that a little bit more closely so that we can get a better idea of what's going on for our story. Let's go back to the A to Z, to the Chatham website, and look up the Bloomsbury Food Library. And this is such a cool, I have intense jealousy that you get to have access to both of these, Food Studies Online and the Food Library. But if you scroll down and you look at the Object Lessons series, that's a really cool, it's a really neat series. And the egg chapter was my favorite. It's just sort of the history of these subjects, and they are really fascinating to take a look at. If you go back actually to the image, if you just go back to the main page, or the home page, the image collections too, super fascinating. So this is a really neat way to take a look at menus, cookbooks, things like that. So this is a really neat resource too. And then finally, Food Studies Online. We can take a look at that one too. And two fascinating little tidbits I found on this one were, if you scroll down, I think, oh, maybe not. You might have to search for it. They have something called the cheese reporter. Which I just loved. Oh, maybe they don't. Anyway, I think it's on there. It was one of their featured things at one point, but the Food Studies Online database is really fascinating because, as you can see, even on this search result, it has documentaries about the history of food. It has a lot of those resources that talk about the relationship that humans have with food. And so that could be a cool resource if you're writing about any of that, if any of your characters might need to know this information. Anyway, three very cool resources that you have access to. All right, you can stop sharing. Thank you so much, Joe. And I'll share now. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about fairly quickly is public library databases. And if you are in Pittsburgh, you have access to the public library database collection. So a lot like academic libraries, public libraries subscribe to certain databases, so you have access to them for free with your library card. And of course, library cards free. So if you don't have one yet, it's easy to sign up. I would really encourage you to do it. And when you go onto the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh website, you can look in, I believe it's resources, and they have a spot here that says research resources. And if you click on that, you'll have access to all of the databases that they have access to. One of those is PA Access. And that is a really great resource. It sort of connects all of the libraries, and it includes all the electronic databases, digital collections, a chat service. So if you are ever stuck and can't find what you need at the library, PA Access is a really cool resource because, like I said, it sort of connects all the libraries and is a really great thing to know about. It's state specific, but it's a really great resource. African American Experience. This is a really neat resource that you have access to at the public library. Fairly self-explanatory, but it includes a ton of really awesome resources from, as you can see, a lot of different time periods. There are even more. I mean, you can scroll through this carousel and see how many time periods there are. It's a really neat resource to dig into. Applied Science and Technology. Again, if you're interested in, I have a love of Michael Crichton that goes so deep. So I'm always thinking about the research that he probably had to do for a lot of his books. But if you are writing about someone who has an expertise or works in science and technology, if you need to look at videos of robots doing surgery, or if you need to know about a certain system, this is a really great resource to take a look at as well. Fold 3 is a U.S. military records site. So you can take a look at resources that have to do with a certain time period or a certain conflict. It has photos, personal documents of folks who served. It has access to indexes of records, historical newspapers, a ton of really awesome stuff. This was one example. You can see it's extensive, the kinds of filtering that you can do to look at the kinds of records they have. So I just did kind of a random one: the War of 1812, naval Navy officers' letters, and found 2 letters from this guy that looked really fascinating. And so again, a really interesting resource, especially if you're looking at a certain time period or a certain conflict. Green File and Greener, these are resources that have to do with environmental history, our relationship with the environment, a lot of different disciplines like agriculture, education, law, health, technology. So if you are writing about anything that has to do with climate change or anything about the environment, pretty cool resources to have access to. This is an example page from Greener. It gives you a really great overview, as you can see, and on the side, relevant articles, some related subjects as well. And then Historic Pittsburgh, again, really local, but it's a great image resource and document resource. This is a project between the University of Pittsburgh and several libraries and museums around the city. So they collected a ton of images and maps that sort of cover a wide range of Pittsburgh history in really cool curated collections. One great thing to note about Historic Pittsburgh is the finding aids. You can see it on the bottom left. Super handy when it comes to navigating this particular database, especially if you need to find a certain part of town or a certain time period, a certain person or place. Anyway, Historic Pittsburgh, again, it's hyper local. So if you're writing about Pittsburgh, very useful, but resources like this exist in many, if not most, cities. And so you can find
yeah,
that might have to do with your particular setting. And then this is what I'll call atmospheric research. And these are just some alternative methods of research that you might want to consider if you're thinking about where to look for facts or for support in your writing. So I do this all the time when I'm researching for writing, and I bet that some of you do too. If you're writing about a certain place, it can be super helpful to take a virtual walk around. So Google Earth or Google Images are really helpful tools to do this, to get a sense of how far away the grocery store really is from this person's house, or what the roads look like in this certain area. Similarly, YouTube videos, super helpful. I always say that my favorite TV show is YouTube because there's just so much random stuff out there. So let's say a character plays a specific video game. There's probably a walkthrough on YouTube. Is your main character really good at a certain skill that you don't know that much about? There's probably a tutorial. There are tutorials about caning chairs, about making butter. I mean, that's a really rich resource too that we might not think of as research, but very handy to set the scene. Cookbooks can be super helpful when you're creating an atmosphere. Some of the databases I mentioned before could be really helpful when thinking about building atmosphere, but cookbooks can give sometimes unpredictable insight into a particular era and might fill in some gaps you didn't even know you had. For example, I meant to bring it up here, but I have a Betty Crocker outdoor cooking book from probably the 50s. And it's a cute book. It's full of really cute recipes that use Dutch ovens and campfires. What it uses a lot of, though, is dangerous materials. So it uses asbestos gloves, a lot of really interesting things that we now know better than to use, but I might not have thought about that if I hadn't looked at that cookbook from the 50s to think about, oh my gosh, our characters might have been using, for example, asbestos pot holders while they were out camping, which, is an example you might not use, but fascinating to know. And then travel guides, nature guides, trail maps, really useful for getting a sense of what the land looks like that you're writing about, especially if your place is set in a rural spot. topographical maps could give you a really great idea of what the landscape looks like, which could inform a lot of your writing as well. Okay, so what I'd like to do is a couple activities. So I'm gonna put some links in the chat, and I'd like you to take a look at one of these short stories or poems. Skim it. Some of them are a little longer than others, but just skim one of them. And this is a really good exercise to do when you're thinking about research in your own pieces, is to skim your writing and note the things that you've had to research. And I'll get to why that's important in a bit. But for now, we'll do it on other people's work. But I want you to just make a note of what you might have had to research, just one or two examples as you skim through this piece. And I want you to mark those mentally and think about where you might have looked for that research. So skim one of these short stories or poems just very lightly. We're going to take like 3 minutes or 5 minutes to do this. Pick out a couple things that you might have had to research. And then where would you have looked? And hopefully, I think that all of these, I think especially the New Yorker and the Atlantic articles, if you haven't met your quota of free articles for the day, you should be able to access both of those. But let me know if you can. And then once you have those, once you have an idea of where you might have looked, feel free to share out anything that's interesting about these that you might have had to research. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, great. So in plans for altering the river, maybe researching river projects and how that's done. Maybe government websites, academic articles, maybe Greener or Green Life, one of those that we talked about from the public library. 100%. That's a great call. Because yeah, that is something that is a real science and would be helpful to know the actual logistics of, definitely. Great, thank you, Arista. Maybe we'll do 2 more minutes if anyone else wants to add. Nice. So the same story, but maybe adding Jstor for historic photos. Absolutely. Yeah, very helpful. Okay, for the ghost birds, maybe just start at Wikipedia to learn the basics. Info about red zones, the reserve that's mentioned, the Great Western Fire. Great. Yeah. Yeah, these are great. This is awesome. And again, this is a really nice exercise to do on other people's work. It's also really helpful to do in your own work. Go through your own work, note the places where you had to research, or if you're planning out a piece, depending on how you work, maybe noting the spots where you might need to research. So before you even get really into the nitty-gritty, figuring out where you might need to research or where research might come into play, which we'll talk about next. Okay, so for the sake of time, we're going to move on. But if you had another comment, feel free to add it to the chat and I'll see it. So the next thing we're going to talk about is integrating our research. So we did all this cool research. We have all these awesome facts that we know now. What do we do? How do we put it into our work? So the things to ask yourself as you begin to put your research into your work, these are just some of these questions. What purpose does that research serve? So is it atmosphere, character building? So the background of a character, their career, maybe something they know about. Does something you found advance or complicate a conflict within the story? So does it serve that sort of covert purpose, serving a conflict or building up some kind of tension? What's the fact to fiction ratio? So in other words, how fact heavy do we want this piece to be, as opposed to how much are we making up? Are we lending to the story? So in an example like The Martian, which we'll talk about in a little bit, really fact heavy. So a lot of that is based in fact. A lot of it is, it's a very fact heavy book. But if we're reading a sci-fi book, for example, a lot of that, it might be more fiction than fact, but a lot of it is based in fact. We might have had to do a lot of research in order to make up some of the cool stuff that we made up for that story. And then where do these findings belong? So should there be some scene setting, exposition? Is there a moment when a character needs to perform a certain task or know a certain thing? What's necessary and what's unnecessary? And to that end, there's a really great article about integrating research into your fiction, and it's by an author and professor named Jake Wolf. But before I get into that, when I went to his Twitter not long ago, I found this tweet that I thought was kind of funny, somewhat relevant to what we're talking about today. Creative nonfiction writers be like, I first ate a hot dog when I was 6 years old. I remember the taste, the scent, the summer. Hot dogs were invented in 1693 by Stephen Hot Dog, according to Scientific American. Anyway, I just thought it was a funny aside when I went to his Twitter to learn more about him. But in his article, his post about, which I'll put in the chat, his post about incorporating research into writing. It's a really great little article, and one excerpt that I found kind of helpful was this. I once received a note from my editor saying that a certain chapter of my novel read too much like a chemistry textbook. At first, I was baffled. I didn't think of the chapter as being overly research forward, but upon reading it again, I realized I'd missed the problem. After learning so much about chemistry, I could no longer see the amount of research I had crammed into 20 pages. This is such an important thing to remember. As you can tell, I love researching and finding facts. I love it. I yell about it at dinner parties. I share weird open access resources I find with my friends to probably an annoying degree. So I'm definitely familiar with this problem, that you get so wrapped up in the research that you can't see past it, because you spent all this time finding out all these wonderful things about your subject and you want to share them. But unfortunately, some of that is probably unnecessary, or at the very least can be put somewhere else in the piece. So we're going to do a couple short exercises right now. There are a few excerpts that I want to show you. So I truly apologize to make you read from a screen, read a lot of words from a screen. But we're going to do this exercise. This excerpt is from The Martian by Andy Weir. So if you recall, the plot of the story is that Mark Watney, a botanist, has been stranded on Mars and needs to use his own smarts to survive. It's written from a first-person daily log perspective. So there are sort of journal entries. So I want you to read this excerpt, and I want you to think about what was probably researched and what that research does for the story. And then, do you think it's too researchy? Do you think this has the problem that Jake Wolf had? So what was probably researched for this? What does the research do for this story? And I might read these just for the sake of accessibility here. So this is the excerpt. But oxygen is easier to find on Mars than you might think. The atmosphere is 98% CO2, and I happen to have a machine whose sole purpose is liberating oxygen from CO2. Yay, oxygenator. One problem: the atmosphere is very thin, about 1/90th the pressure on Earth, so it's hard to collect. Getting air from outside to inside is nearly impossible. The whole purpose of the HAB is to keep that sort of thing from happening. The tiny amount of Martian atmosphere that enters when I use an airlock is laughable. So what do we think was researched, and what does it do for the story? And you can feel free to unmute or put in the chat, whatever you think. Might have been researched for this. Yeah, so the differences in atmospheres, yeah. And it explains how that would actually affect a person on Mars. So yeah, I agree. I think that the purpose of sharing this kind of adds to the tension. So it points out the differences of what it would really be like to have this dilemma of needing to create oxygen. And pointing out the exact how thin the pressure is on Earth, how thin the atmosphere is, how weak the pressure is. So it kind of builds the tension. Yeah. And scientific research of the planet Mars. Yeah. So checking out what's happening on Mars. So how about this? This is from Road. So that book that I talked about and that I'm rereading. This book was inspired by the song The Tennessee Stud by Jimmy Driftwood. He traveled the route that the song does. So from Tennessee to Mexico, he visited racetracks, Spanish missions, a farm, national parks. So this research journey not only helped him fill in historical details, but it also gave him some fodder for creating new characters, making dialogue more accurate, drawing on the logistical and emotional realities of these locations. So we'll take a look at this one. Same question: what was probably researched? What does the research do for the story? Johnson stayed mostly in the woods, pine and cedar so thick the ground was covered with needles. The water, tinged with pine sap, had a smoky tang. 4 or 5 days passed before he reached bottom land. Later, he would learn he was in the Red River Valley. The opening of landscape foretold prairie and humid hazy sky. The land lay thick and rich with grass. As he abandoned the trees, he felt as though he'd finally thrown himself ahead of any other living creature. The red was a wide river, and he moved north and west in line with the bluffs, hoping to spot a cave in the rocks for shelter. He and the stud needed to catch breath to rest, to fatten for a time in this good grass. Overhead, 2 buzzards floated in lazy circles. A ways upriver, Johnson discovered why. So what was probably researched for this, and what does it do for the story? Yeah, so I wouldn't know if I was writing this. I would need to look either via Google Maps or maybe some local nature websites, maybe some local nature guides. I'd need to look at the landscape so that I could accurately say what it would look like there. Yeah. What else? Yeah, Google Maps is a really great resource. Yeah, the detail of pine sap. So I would say too, I would look at maybe bird guides, nature guides, to figure out what kind of flora and fauna live here. So if I'm talking about, if I want to give that really rich detail of pine sap, I want to know what kind of trees, what kinds of plants live in the Red River Valley, because it's probably fairly specific. If it's in the Southwest, right? Not everything that lives here, for example, will be down there. So I'd need to familiarize myself with the kinds of flora and fauna that live there. And in the end, I think too, the buzzards, what kinds of carrion eaters live down there? What are we thinking? What are we looking at? And in this case, it really creates this rich texture. The protagonist is has a very intimate relationship with nature in this book. And so I think by adding those really researched details, it really builds that relationship between the characters, and of course the buzzards building that tension too. So I have two poems as well. So maybe we'll do these quickly, and then I have one more activity to do that I might just give you to do on your own, and then we'll talk about tracking our research. So let's do these two poems quickly. This is from a poem by Dilruba Ahmed, and this is called The Incidents. The average houseplant will not kill unless touched by radiation, 1,000-fold the upper limit. Then one leaf fed to a larva produces broken butterflies with broken DNA. With each generation, the nightmare worsens. Here are wings shaped like folded ears instead of pristine leaves. What is DNA but a text the body reads? What are genes but a few pages ripped from the spine of a book already aflame? So what do we think Dilruba might have had to research for this? And what does this do for the poem, that research? I just realized you can see my little dog rummaging around in the background. Yeah, houseplants, maybe radiation impacts, how radiation affects plants. I mean, I think that these are probably based in fact, the effect of radiation on a plant, how dangerous it is. Yeah, radiation's impact on DNA, how it's passed from organism to organism. And while this doesn't get super fact heavy, it's not weighed down with fact. It's an essential part of the poem, and it really makes the poem richer, this probable research that was probably done. And this, I would have probably used either a scientific or technology, that science and technology resource that we looked at. And this one is by Virgil Suarez. Paul Klee visits Santiago de Cuba. Beyond the flying cities, the crosses, stripes, this crop of dots hidden in the horizon. You can count them and find your way back anywhere if you ask the sidewalk cracks. They will show you the way, these little veins and rivers on the walls. He came here because he'd heard about a particular hue of blue he'd heard a bird carried on its chest. The painted bunting. See it with his own eyes, this bird of paradise. But instead, he fell in love with the way light filled everything, the liquid prism mirrored on the surface of the water. A blue missing from his palette, luminous, a tincture of diaphanous indigo, a straight line so blue it drew breath from onlookers. Call it a wisp of the real blues. Those gathered on the shore gaze out at the distance where they claim to see the fading lights of another shore, another country, an artist mesmerized by a bird's spectral colors. So same questions. What did they probably research? And what impact does it have? Yeah, different shades of blue. Yeah, that's a good call. And Paul Klee, yeah, I would have used Artstor, Jstor's art database, to look at that painting, maybe more of Paul Klee's work. Maybe Paul Klee's, yeah, like you said, the art he created, the places he went, maybe more about him as a person. I also would have looked up, probably would have looked up the birds that the painted bunting. I would have looked up, used, Sibley's or Audubon to take a look at those birds, to take a look at what they looked like, the colors. Yeah. And I think it adds color to the poem, all this research. Really, it's really clear that this person spent a lot of time with either Paul Klee, looking at Paul Klee's body of work, or specifically this painting. But yeah, just a richer landscape, definitely. All right, thank you for doing that with me. It's just kind of a fun exercise to think about how we might integrate our research into our work. And finally, tracking our research. The last stage of the research process, but one that should be happening throughout, organizing your sources. So there are some tools like Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote Basic. Those are all free. They do a great job of keeping all your sources in one place and generating citations for you. A lot of those databases I told you about tonight are linked to one or more of those services. So you can just click and upload a citation to your chosen management tool. And if not, there's often a Cite This button on individual articles. And that gives you absolutely no excuse not to track your research. They make it very easy to do that. But really, whatever works for you is the best. Even a spreadsheet like this one could be perfect for your needs. And I use something like this, the author, the title, what format it is, if I used it or not, and where I used it, and then a citation and a link. Reference managers, like the ones at the bottom of the screen here, are really great. But one thing to keep in mind is even if you don't end up using all your sources, it's beneficial to keep track of them as you go, because you might want to use it later. It might end up in a, you might want to use that detail after all, and you want to know where you found it. So go into the process, the research process, with the mindset of tracking your progress in some way, especially when it comes to researching for your thesis, just because you want to keep track of as much stuff as you can as you go. It always happens that I think of a quote that I found somewhere and then have to rifle through everything all over again to find it. Much easier to just keep a running tab. And then acknowledging. So this is done in a lot of different ways in fiction. Someone mentioned sometimes you have footnotes. Sometimes you have a works cited, section, reference section in the back of your book. Depends on what kind of book you're writing. You can have an acknowledgements section. So that's what Thomas Fox Averill did and wrote, just an acknowledgements section that thanked the university that he worked with, the various land keepers and folks who he worked with to do research for the book. A dedications page, the preface, or something else entirely. It really depends in fiction. We want to acknowledge our sources and note the research that we did, but it depends. It depends how fact heavy your work is, but thinking about how that might fit into your work is important as well. And then these are the two articles that I mentioned tonight, if you're interested in looking at those. And that is it for me. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. There's also an activity that I wanted to do, but wasn't sure I was going to have time, and I didn't. So I'll leave it to you to do on your own time. But Jake Wolf, the guy who did that article that was so handy, he says it's very simple. When I'm trying to rebalance the research in my fiction, I list 2 facts I've learned from my research, and then invent 1 fact that sounds true but isn't. So the idea is to acquaint yourself with the sound of the truth when it comes to a given subject, and then to recreate that sound in a fiction way. So it's a way to provide balance and productivity, ensuring that you're continuing to imagine and invent even as you're researching. So this is a really fascinating activity to do as well, to think about 2 facts you've learned from your research and then invent a fact that sounds true but isn't. A fun way to sort of create that balance of that fact to fiction ratio that we were talking about. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, I can share this slideshow. It has all the links in the notes and stuff. And yeah, if you have any questions now, if you need any links now, I'm happy to share. And thank you all so much for coming. It's really fun to chat about, and thanks for participating too. I know it's asking a lot after a long day to participate in something, but thank you.
Yes, thank you for your time and your generosity, all this great research information. I'm sure we'll put it to good use. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.